Welcome. My name is Shenzhen Liao, Senior Vice President of Education at China Institute. Thanks for tuning in for Beethoven in China, the Philadelphia Orchestra, and the Power of Cultural Bridges. This is the second session of a two-part program that is brought together through Music at China Institute, 华美音乐, a partnership between China Institute and the US-China Music Institute at Bard College that's envisioned to bring the power of music on bridging US and China through discussions, performances, and music classes. Conductor and Professor Jindong Cai, who will speak tonight, is the Artistic Director of Music at China Institute. We are particularly glad to present Beethoven in China this summer as the power of cultural bridges through music feels even more critical in today's world. Before we introduce our speakers this evening, I just want to say for 95 years of its history in New York, it's exciting that China Institute is now welcoming speakers, viewers, and students of Chinese language and culture online from all over the world. And of course, we want to welcome you to our beautiful space in downtown Manhattan when we are ready and when you are ready to travel. Now, I'm turning to Dinda Elliott, Senior Vice President of Programming at China Institute, also the moderator of tonight's program, to introduce our distinguished speakers. Dinda, please.
Wonderful. Shenzhen, thank you so much. And I am just so thrilled to be joined tonight by the three people who are really absolutely the closest to this film, Beethoven in Beijing. Jindong Cai, as Shenzhen mentioned, is a conductor, author, and educator, and he's the director of the US-China Music Institute, co-director of the Chinese Music Development Initiative, and professor of music and arts at Bard College. And as Shenzhen mentioned, we hold him especially close to our hearts because Jindong brought music to China Institute. So with a wonderful partnership with his institute at Bard. Before joining Bard, he was a professor of performance at Stanford University. Jindong has conducted most of the top orchestras in China and orchestras across North America, and he co-authored with his wife Sheila Melvin, Rhapsody in Red, How Western Classical Music Became Chinese, as well as Beethoven in China, How the Great Composer Became an Icon in the People's Republic. Jennifer Lin is the co-director and producer of the film I hope you've all just watched, Beethoven in Beijing. Jennifer lived and worked in China for 4 years as Asia correspondent for the Philadelphia Inquirer, where she worked for 31 years. An award-winning reporter, Lin is also author of 2 books, including a family memoir called Shanghai Faithful, Betrayal and Forgiveness in a Chinese Christian Family. Nicholas Platt really needs no introduction. He had a long and illustrious career in the Foreign Service, serving as ambassador to Zambia, the Philippines, and Pakistan before he became president of the Asia Society, where he is now president emeritus. Ambassador Platt, who speaks perfect Chinese, began his career in China as a China analyst at the US Consulate General in Hong Kong in the late 60s. In 1972, he accompanied President Nixon on the historic trip to Beijing that signaled the resumption of relations between the United States and China. And he was one of the first members of the US Liaison Office in Beijing in 1973. In recent years, Ambassador Platt has advised the Philadelphia Orchestra on its China projects. So we're so thrilled to have all of you here with us. Thank you for joining. So let's just jump right in. Jennifer, I think we'll start with you as the producer and director. For those of our viewers who may not have had a chance to see the film clip yet, and I do urge you all to watch it in the next day or after, because it's really an incredible film. But Jennifer, tell us a little bit about what the film is, how it came to be, and how you launched it, how you became.
Sure. Yes. So thank you to the China Institute for giving us this opportunity to talk about the documentary. So Beethoven in Beijing really uses the China legacy of the Philadelphia Orchestra in China to show how this revival of classical music is energizing the entire world of music. And we used the 1973 tour of the Philadelphia Orchestra in China. They were the first American orchestra to perform there. We use that as a jumping off point. But really, the movie spans nearly a half century. And so through the orchestra, we show how classical music really has evolved in China. And the orchestra has has many collaborations with Chinese musicians and really is the perfect storyteller for this. And Dinda, the seed for this project really was planted, I think, in 2008. And back then, I was a reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer. And my editor came up to me, he said, we'd like for you to go to China to cover the 35th anniversary concert of the Philadelphia Orchestra in China. The two classical music critics couldn't make the trip, so they came to me. And the reason was I had been a foreign correspondent in China in the 1990s. So I'm always up for, a trip to China. And they didn't come to me because of my vast knowledge of classical music, but they came to me because I understood China. And I did what any reporter would do, since I didn't know what I was reporting about. And I just kind of plunged into trying to get my head around not only the history of the orchestra in China, but also the classical music scene. And so if you're going to be writing about those topics, there are three people that you call immediately. You call Jindong Cai and Sheila Melvin, who literally wrote the book on classical music in China. And you call Nick Platt, who was on the ground in Beijing in 1973 when the orchestra came. And he and his wife Sheila were actually kind of the minders of Eugene Ormandy when he was in China. So in 2008, I started reporting about classical music in China. I started actually at the Curtis Institute of Music with Gary Grafman, the legendary pianist who was also the tutor of Lang Lang, Yu Jia Wang, and Zhang Haochen, arguably three of the top pianists in China. And then once I got to China in the spring of 2008, in advance of the Philadelphia Orchestra, I was trying to understand what was happening, and I was surprised to see that there was a real boom in interest in classical music. So I went to a school in Beijing where parents were taking their children on a Saturday to have piano lessons. I flew down to Gulangyu in Fujian province and went to the home of Yin Chenzong, who was the pianist who performed with the Philadelphia Orchestra in 1973 and co-wrote the Yellow River Concerto.
Wow.
And then the big event, of course, was
what was that musician doing in 2008 in Gulangyu?
He splits his time between New York and Gulangyu. In the summertime, he gives classes, mostly in China. But the big event was the actual concert, which was June 1st, 2008. And they performed the exact program that they did in 1973. And it wasn't in the wonderful NCPA Big A concert hall. It was in the old hall where they performed in 1973. And the music, of course, was gorgeous. But what really struck me was when people were leaving, I was interviewing the Chinese concert goers to ask them about the concert. And I was really struck by the profound sentiment that many Chinese had towards this orchestra, not orchestral music, this orchestra. And I didn't realize kind of the impact the Philadelphia Orchestra had in China since 1973. And I thought to myself, how do I not know this? I'm from Philadelphia. I was a China correspondent for years. I fancy myself a China hand, and I really didn't understand the orchestra's legacy. And, when we study US-China relations, we all hear about ping pong diplomacy. But what we don't hear as much about is what Jindong and Sheila, describe as music diplomacy. So in that year, it was a very important year, 1973, Zhou Enlai invited three orchestras. He invited the London Phil, the Vienna Phil, and the Philadelphia Orchestra. But it was all about diplomacy. And it was the Americans that he was trying to win over. That's why of those three, it was the Philadelphia Orchestra's performance that really mattered the most in their visit. It was a way of trying, it was cultural diplomacy, trying to soften the image of Westerners for the Chinese people. So when I went back to Philadelphia 2008, I just started mining this story. I tried looking up, tracking down musicians who had been to China in 1973. I went to the University of Pennsylvania archives where the Ormandy papers are kept. And I just kind of kept chipping away at it, thinking in the back of my head that this would make a great film. This is a story that should be heard and seen, not only written about, but heard. So in 2016, I had left the Philadelphia Inquirer, and I reached out to a Philadelphia filmmaker by the name of Sam Katz. Sam Katz has a company. He's known for his historical documentaries, and I reached out to Sam and I said, what do you think of this? And Sam signed on. Also signing on to help was Sharon Mullally, who's the co-director. And so in 2016, with the blessing of the Philadelphia Orchestra, we launched this project. And we went to China in May of 2016 to cover the orchestra's tour, which included Long Long, who was making an appearance. And that really was the start of it. We went to China 4 times, and we locked or finished our production on March the 1st of this year. And then the world ended. So,
Wow.
It's a great opportunity to be able to talk to your audience about our film, because it's been a little bit of a change of plans in terms of distributing the film. We've entered a lot of film festivals, got into a lot, and so we're just trying to adjust our plans as we move ahead. So that's the project in a nutshell.
Yeah. Well, I haven't seen the whole film. I can't wait to see the whole thing, and look forward to doing so at these film festivals, etc. But the extended clip that the piece of it that I watched was just incredible, and I love so much you bring this journalistic eye to the whole thing and realize that you're really telling the story of China. It's diplomatic history. It's the story of China through music and through this orchestra. It's just so marvelous what you've done. So really.
Exactly. Yeah, and we try to show, try to address the question of why is classical music becoming so popular in China. And so we use Chinese musicians, the composer Tan Dun, Long Long, and the young composer Peng Peng, to really show that arc. And all 3 of them have very close associations with the Philadelphia Orchestra.
Right.
So that's why the orchestra is such a perfect character for this story.
It's great, and we'll walk through that story a little bit later in the conversation. But Ambassador Platt, first, I wanted to turn to you as the diplomat in the group to talk a little bit about what the significance of that first trip in 1973 was. I can just only imagine it was still really the middle of the Cultural Revolution, sort of starting to, calm down a little bit, but it's the Cultural Revolution nonetheless. And in comes this Philadelphia Orchestra. How on earth did this come to pass?
Well, let me give you a little bit of historical background. The opening to China, as you know, started in '72 when Nixon visited. And I was on that trip too. I was on that trip as Secretary of State, the Secretary of State's assistant. And I took notes and I did all things that, that staffers do. But that led to me being assigned to Beijing when we opened up our liaison office.
Yeah.
The first resident office in China for several decades since we left in '49. And the Chinese set up a liaison office in Beijing. These were sort of diplomatic halfway houses, not quite embassies, but capable of doing most of the things that embassies do. But the important thing was that there were really 2 openings to China. One was Nixon's, which was diplomatic and very important, and it changed the balance of power. It affected foreign policy for years to come. When the liaison offices were open, then the infrastructure existed for visits by different delegations. And this is when really the people-to-people, the private relationship between Americans and Chinese began. And when I say private relationship, I mean that the decisions to engage in it are made basically by people who are not government officials. Now, when we had been in Beijing since April, September came around, we had a whole range of different delegations coming. And I realized that this private opening to the Chinese was significant because of the pent-up curiosity on the part of Americans about Chinese and vice versa became apparent as these different groups, whether they were aircraft salesmen or congressmen or swimmers or basketball players, well, there had to be a cultural side to this. And so the orchestra, the Philadelphia Orchestra, was the American star of that. And people ask me, well, how did that happen? And I think it's because, because Ormandy and the orchestra, Ormandy and Stokowski and the people who made that orchestra great, always wanted to be the first to do things. They wanted to do new things. And they did a variety of new things. They also put on a big concert in the 1940s during World War II with China as they fought Japan as the beneficiary. Well, anyway, during the Cultural Revolution, let me tell you, I mean, this job of taking care of the Philadelphia Orchestra was widely avoided by my contemporaries because they said, look, this is the Cultural Revolution, and the Madame Mao is in charge of culture, and so you're going to have to deal directly with her. And I said, well, look, I'm the head of the political section. Politics and culture are synonymous. I have to do this. And my boss, David Bruce, said, yes, you do. And in fact, it was quite fascinating. And it was one of the great things that's happened to me in my life, because the orchestra itself is not only so skilled musically, but in terms of the people's skills, they were just marvelous.
Wow.
Now,
so Ambassador, I know that at that time you actually had to use your diplomatic skills, I know, with Eugene Ormandy, right? So you can tell us a little bit about that, a little kerfuffle about the symphony. And, I don't know what kinds of diplomatic skills you had to use with the Chinese too, but can you share a little bit of that with us?
Well, sure. Well, we've been talking about this visit for months. And we've been negotiating with the Chinese musical cadres who were all frightened to death of Madame Mao and really worried about making mistakes and really careful about the lead up to all of this. And we had months of negotiations on the actual programs. They said, oh, Afternoon of the Faun is too prurient, too gross. We can't do that. Schubert is fine. Mozart is fine. They're both sort of political neuters, I thought. And we had conversations about the one thing that there had not been agreement on was what Beethoven symphony to play. Madame Mao obviously wanted Beethoven 6, because that came down very clearly. But Ormandy told us, I hate Beethoven 6. And I'll play the 5th, I'll play the 7th, but I won't play the 6th. Well, we kind of left it there. And unresolved questions have a way of popping up. And so when other delegations came, I always tried to meet with the cadres who I'd been negotiating with beforehand and get to know them. And I had a very hard time doing that with the musical officials. Anyway, I went down to Shanghai to meet the orchestra, which had been traveling for 22 hours or something on a Pan Am plane, and to escort Ormandy back to Beijing and use those 2 hours as a way of getting to know him, and as it turned out, as a way of solving a very nettlesome problem. Anyway, a half an hour before the orchestra arrived, and we were about to be inundated with 130 dead tired people, wondering what the hell they were and what they're doing there, led by a famous person who I'd never met. Half an hour before they arrived, the musical cadre I've been trying to connect with came in and said, I have a strong request, which is you're not going to like, but it's coming from the very top, and they want to add a concert, and they want to make it a leadership concert, and they want Ormandy to play Beethoven's Sixth. And my heart sank. That this is obviously coming from her. We have to figure out a way of turning this around, because I think the whole visit kind of depends on getting this right. Anyway, I got on the plane with Ormandy. I sat next to him. He's a little tiny man, and I said, I thought I better jump in. I said, Maestro, look, we've got a message from the very top, which says that they would like you to play Beethoven's Sixth Symphony. And he says, he looks at me, he looks up at me, he says, you know I hate that symphony, and I don't want to play it, and I didn't bring any scores. Well, I said, okay, let me tell you, Maestro, let me try and explain why it is that the Chinese are so interested and fixated on Beethoven's Sixth. And it was at this point I did what diplomats are really paid to do. I started to make things up. But make things up, I hoped, in a sensible and believable way. I said, now, the Chinese, if you look at the history of Chinese music, what Chinese music really values is what we call program music. It's music that describes scenes, it describes battles, they describe scenery, moonlight on lakes, and so on and so forth. And of course, Beethoven's Sixth is one of the great pieces of program music that the Western world has ever produced. And it's all about describing scenes of life in the countryside. Well, you have to remember that the Chinese communists came to power on the back of a peasant revolution. And this is all about farmers and peasants. And you have the fourth movement, there's a big storm in it. And that the Chinese communists believe is the revolution. And then you have, at the end, you have a quiet, triumphant ending, which I think was what Ormandy really hated. He loved endings that were very, that were loud and emphatic. Anyway, so this is the story. This is why. And he looks at me and he kind of rolls his eyes and he says, well, when in Rome, we better do as the Romans do. But I didn't bring any scores. You have to get scores for me. I said, look, fine. But I was so relieved at that point, I couldn't believe it. And I said, you leave that to us. We'll figure that out. And so we got 70 scores from Shanghai and 60 scores from Beijing, and all the bowings and markings were different, but the orchestra knew how to play that symphony, and they knew how to watch Ormandy, and went off very well. Anyway, that's kind of my...
Great story. It's
my
a great story.
diplomatic story.
Yes, thank you, thank you, thank you. So Jindong, at the time, you were really just a boy, I guess. And I know in the film you describe, you know, going to Tiananmen and hoping to catch a glimpse of the visiting delegation, et cetera, which I guess you weren't lucky enough to do. But I really am curious about what that moment felt like in China at the time, and what happened to these musicians during the Cultural Revolution. I mean, what was, just to help set the stage a little bit for just how dramatic, from the Chinese perspective, how dramatic that moment was. How was it that these musicians were even able to play Beethoven?
Yeah, I know. It's oh, first of all, I'm so honored to be here with Nick. You know, I hope all the politicians and diplomats had that kind of skill to dealing with Chinese leaders or something.
A lot of baloney is what he is.
Well, anyway, yeah, I was a teenager. You know, in 1972, I have to say, in 1972, I was a teenager. So we were told Americans is the enemy. So basically, that's what we were told when we were growing up. You know, and when we had the nuclear bomb, we say, hey, this is what we do against America. When we heard Kennedy assassinated, we say something. You know, it's definitely, we grew up at that. And then suddenly Nixon is in come. So that's really shock to everyone. But, you know, for me as a teenager, I just want to see what is coming out. And just happened that day when Nixon visited the Forbidden City, we had a field trip to go to the Forbidden City, to visit the Forbidden City. And then when we get into the Forbidden City, they stopped it and said, you cannot go today because there's a special event. So we have to walk back. But just before we walk back, then there's a couple of, an official came out to say, oh, let's have some children to be in the Forbidden City.
Oh my God.
To decorate, right? To decorate this situation. So I remember very clearly that was a big snow day. And we went to the Forbidden City. It was beautiful, white everywhere. We're trying to find where Nixon was. I didn't see him, but definitely that really left a very, very profound expression to me. Then next year, and by then I already playing the violin. You know, we played the violin. Even during the Cultural Revolution, you're not allowed to play Beethoven, play Mozart, but you're allowed to learn the instrument and to play revolutionary songs. So that's how I started violin.
So how were your parents teaching you how to play violin, or what was your?
No, actually, yeah. What we do during the Cultural Revolution, the first few years, it was a chaos. You know, there's no school, there's nothing happening, and I always remember I go with those elder classmates, go to the school to see which window has not broken. So we'll break that window. It's basically a chaos, and yeah. I think my parents really didn't want us to, me at least, to do the terrible things. And he know I love music, so actually he bought a used violin for me. So I just started to play the violin. I started to learn by myself, and later I find a teacher just teach me occasionally. So that's how I start. So then, you know, when the 1973, when the Philadelphia Orchestra came to China, that is really big news. It's not only musical news, right? It's basically a society news.
You knew that they were there. You knew that they were there.
Definitely.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
It's a big news, and it's a big news. It's on the front of the newspaper next day, and has a big picture, you know, like and Nick said, you know, there's Madame Mao and musicians all together. So that's actually was big news. So I remember that very clearly. And so from there on, you know, then it just made me just want to learn more about the violin to play. I didn't go to the concert. I was too young.
Yeah. So after that visit, I want to bring us up to today, but walk us through a little bit. So the music scene changed really dramatically in China after that visit, right? I mean, tell us a little bit about what happened then. And by the time they came in 2008, of course, it was completely different. Yeah,
I think, you know, the Cultural Revolution, what happened is Revolution, Mao want to just, the banner to say destroy anything new, old, and old or foreign. right? But the goal for him is not just destroy. He wants to also create something new. So during the Cultural Revolution, he created a model operas that including a symphony. And basically it's modeled after the Beethoven Ninth Symphony. And there's a chorus, orchestra, solo, and so that's kind of a piece. And then after the Philadelphia Orchestra come, then they start to have this reopening, cracking little door, right? So another Philadelphia Orchestra came, also the Vienna Philharmonic, London Philharmonic, later on, the Boston Symphony came, and the Berlin Philharmonic came. For people, for generation like us, this is like the best trick, you know. So I remember when I was freshman in the music school in Beijing, I went to every single rehearsal and concert of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Wow. And the Berlin Philharmonic. You know, the Boston Symphony was led by C.Z. Ozawa, and the Berlin Philharmonic was led by von Karajan. Those are just unbelievable. And I just remember that make me feel like I want to be a musician. You know, when you look at Karajan conducted Berlin Philharmonic, he doesn't move and his eyes closed, but sound came from the orchestra. It's just unbelievable, right? And then you look at the C.Z. Ozawa conducting the Boston Symphony. C.Z. Ozawa is like a acrobat person, like every part of his body is moving. The song came out also just fantastic. You wow. see the power of conducting, right? Yeah. So actually from there on, I do decide I want to be a conductor and I want to go to the West to study classical music.
So at that time, as the Cultural Revolution ends and China is opening up to the outside world and all kinds of new ideas and music and everything is coming in, at that time, did families start wanting their children to start to be playing classical music and started feeling that to be educated, you have to learn this stuff? Or talk about a little bit about how that evolved.
Yeah, I think, traditionally, even before the Cultural Revolution, during the Cultural Revolution and after, I think in general, the Chinese society and the parents or the family see arts as a very important part of society. Music especially, and symphonic music as like have a very specific trait, So there's lots of people learn to study Western classical music, and even during the Cultural Revolution, they learn secretly. And then after the Cultural Revolution, and when the Central Conservatory start to recruiting students, suddenly there are like 20,000 people, young kids, want to get in to try to get 200 spots. So you can see it's a tradition. The society value music, value artists very much. So that's what I think that's the basic. Of course, then later on, when you see those great orchestra visit China, you see those great stars playing solo with the orchestra, and then China started have their own stars like Lang Lang, Li Yunli, and all those people. And then, Chinese parents, and they only have one kid. So they want everything best for the kids.
Right.
And so music is a very, very important part of this.
Can I chime in here?
Yes.
My experience was...
We lost your picture, but we can hear you. So just carry on.
My picture, where is my picture?
That's fine, don't worry. We can't see you, but we can hear you. So just keep talking.
I didn't turn my picture off. The host has asked me to start my video. Okay.
Okay, good. So yeah, there
we
go.
It is.
Okay.
Here you are. Okay.
Hello, Nick.
After the visit in '73, the orchestra didn't come back for a long time.
Yes.
But the ingredients that Jindong Cai is describing were definitely there. Nixon visited a great big facility with a lot of children were playing instruments and so on and so forth. So the tradition was there. Mm-hmm. And then I think that as China grew more and more economically wealthy,
yes, affluent,
people could afford the ideas, the tickets, and so forth. And the Chinese then began to get interested in our musical and our cultural institutions began to get interested in long-term arrangements with China. And so in 2010, I met with the orchestra by chance, and then they invited me to be an advisor in a new stage of their relationship with China, in which they wanted to not only play in various cities and perform, but also to train and the stay and teach. And the Chinese, we found, wanted to upgrade their orchestras. They wanted their orchestras to have the quality to tour abroad, and also the knowledge and the contacts to tour abroad. And of course, they asked us to help with all of that, and we did. So the Chinese government, I think, saw music as an element of soft power, and they had learned enough about soft power to know that it doesn't work unless it's really good. And so they tried to figure out how to solve that. And the orchestra has been very helpful in that respect. And in the years since 2012, the orchestra's gone many times, full orchestra, and they have a regular series of training sessions and pop-up concerts and, side-by-side concerts and so on and so forth.
And this is
and they spent a lot of time in conservatories and so forth. Right now, the conservatories are getting lots of money in China.
Yeah.
And so I've always struggled with the idea of why the Chinese like American symphonic music. And my private theory is that Chinese art and Chinese culture has, as I mentioned before, favored the program music, favored non-abstract forms of expression. And with the exception of calligraphy, there is no abstract form that Chinese is indigenous. And so symphonic music, I think, fills a need there. And they've always liked it ever since they were introduced to it. The Chinese also value things that involve collective action. And there's nothing that requires better, more purposeful collective action than a symphony orchestra. And of course, the Chinese love grand things. And there's nothing grander than the sound of a full orchestra. So those are my private thoughts on why the Chinese like symphonic music. But in any case, they really do. And their orchestras are getting are up to world class and are beginning to tour. Another point.
Go ahead, Nick, and then I've got a question.
The Chinese told me, quite honestly, they said, for all of our emphasis on collective activity, we're not very good at ensembles, and so we need help with that.
Interesting.
And in addition, they said they wanted to have a real chance to train their soloists. They're very good at identifying soloists and bringing them up to a certain level. But then the Longlongs of this world found that in order for them, and Tandun and so forth, in order for them to get the international polish and recognition that they needed to get to the next stage, they had to go to a European or an American conservatory. Mm-hmm. And of course, so the creation of Longlong and Tandun and all these marvelous performers is really a joint effort between the Chinese system and the Western system. And the people who are really good and who really become world stars have to have a little bit of both. So that's my.
So I want to, go ahead, Jennifer. And
yeah,
then
I mean, we've talked about a lot of the factors behind why classical music is booming in China. There's the pent-up demand after the Cultural Revolution, you know, where people wanted to study this art form. There was also the economic boom that gave parents money in their pockets in order to lavish on their only children, and that contributed to this. But the other factor, and we bring this out in the movie too, is China has been investing in music education. And in the United States, the opposite is true. Mm-hmm. Very profoundly here in Philadelphia, you know, public schools are always facing budgetary issues, and music is often on the chopping block. Not today, but there have been periods where, you know, music has been cut back drastically. And this is happening in a lot of American cities, whereas in China, there's been enormous investment in music education, in the music infrastructure. So that's concert halls, it's conservatories. You know, when you go to major Chinese cities, even mid-level cities, second-tier cities, there are these incredible concert halls. I think the conservatory in, correct me, Jindong, but the one in Sichuan has 15,000 students. So Chinese society values music and music education, and that's really then generating, you know, new interest in this. So when you go to a concert in China, and we use this image in our film, the audience is very different than the audiences you would find in the United States. You see a lot of young children, you see a lot of families, a lot of multi-generational groups that are there. And there's a real interest and real curiosity. So, you know, that whole system is kind of increasing the whole audience for classical music.
I'm so glad you raised that. That's just what I was going to ask you. But so for the audience tonight, I want to open it up in a couple minutes. I got one more question before we open it up. But I want to open up to questions from all of you. And what you do is there's a little button on the bottom of your screen, which is a hand. It says raise hand. So if you want to raise your hand in a couple minutes, I hopefully will have an opportunity to call on you, and we'll have a couple of questions. But before we do that, I really wanted to talk for a minute about politics and culture. You know, U.S.-China relations are at such a terrible low point right now. And, you know, with the trade war and a growing call for decoupling of the economies, I wonder, has this affected the kinds of cultural exchanges that you're talking about, and do you worry about that? And then after that, I also want to ask you, what do you think, you know, what is the importance of this kind of cultural exchange at these difficult times? But first, you know, are you worried that there's going to be an impact on this cross-cultural exchange?
My experience has been, and I continue to be a consultant to the Philadelphia Orchestra, and what they want from me is advice that enables them to sort of navigate the political thickets of U.S.-China relations. And so every day I go through the media from China and the articles that are written in the West about China and so on and so forth. And we also have people on the ground in China that we know who are working with Chinese institutions on planning the next stages of the orchestra's activity. And none of this has been affected by the current poisonous atmosphere between Washington and Beijing.
Okay.
This has gone on as normal. The thing that is abnormal is, of course, the fact that you can't travel back and forth.
Right.
We didn't have anything big that was planned for this year. We do for next year, and so that will be the real test.
Okay.
But in recent years, during the creation of this terrible atmosphere we've gone with full orchestra, so on and so forth. And while maybe the provincial first secretary of the party has not come to the concerts or whatever, the audience reaction has been absolutely wild. And they just love this.
That's wonderful. And Jindong, how about you? Are you worried about this? What do you see happening in terms of cross-cultural, this kind of exchange?
Yeah, and as an artist myself, I feel and often see politics divide people, and whatever ideology or and whatever the reason, the political reasons, but the cultures can bring people together. And I think because the culture can bring people together because that's really people relationship. I think American people want to know more about the Chinese people, know more about the Chinese music, and vice versa. That's China too. And also in the past 30 or 40 years, you can see this kind of exchange just through Philadelphia Orchestra's journey in those years. And also you can see the influence Philadelphia Orchestra, had in China. And I can say myself, probably part of that influence, and it made me to be a musician and made me to make my career in America. And in today, you can see so many people in my generation, or you can see many musicians in any American orchestras, opera houses, conservatories. So I think those will never stop. Hopefully we can just break this political chaotic situation and just go back to people connections.
Yeah. And in your own world, Jindong, you have created a wonderful new project at BARD. Tell us a little bit about, which is, this amazing cross-cultural exchange in itself. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing with Chinese music. Yes.
So we created U.S.-China Music Institute at BARD College Conservatory of Music. Our goal is to take this bridge role, right, between America and China. So we want to introduce Chinese music to the West. So we have a Chinese instrument major students at conservatory now. Like you play erhu, pipa, you can get degree from the BARD Conservatory. On the other hand, we export American music education, arts education system to Chinese schools. And so those connections, that's what we're trying to do. And I think, I feel that is the most important thing to continue our relationship.
I remember you saying something really fascinating when we first talked about the fact that Chinese music, I'll probably get it wrong, so you'll correct me, but it was essentially that Chinese music has kind of been in its own bubble and has not been connected to the world as much as you wished. And this is part of the effort to kind of introduce Chinese music to the world.
Yeah, but there are two trains, right? One is Chinese Western classical music in China. It's actually is booming. Yeah,
of course.
But in terms of only Chinese music, or there's a different kind. It's traditional Chinese music and music today. It's a Chinese, people, the composer compose new pieces or the performances, and those I think West need to know. And I think it's a very vibrant in China. And China support most composers make living just by compose. And I think Chinese orchestras, most of the time, they perform contemporary music. And so that's, and in the movie, we have the Philadelphia Orchestra performed several times the Chinese music, and the U.S.-China Music Institution, we do Chinese New Year concert, we do Chinese contemporary composers concert in Carnegie Hall and in New York City. So those actually is a good step, to let West to understand better about Chinese music.
Yeah, but again, to sort of provide some context to people who are listening, it's much easier for a musician to support themselves in China than it is for a musician in America to support themselves, right?
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah, there's a lot of government support for training and performers as well.
Yeah.
But it wasn't always so.
Yes.
In any case,
of course.
Yeah, in a couple of days ago, Shanghai, this is called Shanghai Summer Music Festival, Shanghai Symphony organized it. It's a 10 days festival. Every day there's 2 or 3 concerts, and I watched some couple of concerts live. It's 100 people youth orchestra to play Beethoven 5th Symphony, and they're going to perform Tan Dun's Buddha Passion, and that's a big orchestra and choral piece. So they already restarted.
That's so wonderful to hear. And we will too at some point. So I see there are a couple questions from the audience. And so I'm going to, Aaron, hopefully you can unmute them. And I see there's a question from Lana Xu. Lana, Aaron is going to unmute you and then you can ask your question. Okay, I think if you unmute yourself, I see your microphone is still muted. And in a second, you can ask your question. Aaron, do you have to unmute Lana or can she unmute herself?
She should unmute herself.
Okay, Lana, can you unmute yourself? You have to press the button to unmute yourself. Click on the microphone on your screen so that you can speak. Okay, that's not working. So you know what? We're going to go to another one. And Lana, hopefully you can figure out how to do that. I see another question from Hardy Fippen. So Hardy, we're going to try to unmute you.
Am I
get
unmuted?
you up. There we go. Yep, I think we can hear you, Hardy.
Is there more interest developing about chamber music? You talk so much about the conductor and the orchestra, but in terms of form and getting used to listening to other instruments and exploring other instruments, chamber music is certainly something that is very important in that area. And also, do you ever try to adapt Western music or Western forms to musical instruments, indigenous instruments, Eastern musical instruments?
That's a question for Jindong.
Okay, I can say briefly, then you can chip in as well. Yeah, as for your first question, chamber music for Chinese Western music lovers are a new thing. But in the past, I would say 5 years, and the chamber music scene is really also vibrating. And there are more chamber music groups and perform regularly. And I think chamber music in Lincoln Center, they go to China every year. And they also go to schools and they perform, and for children, they perform in different situations, try to explore chamber music, what is chamber music is about. So I think, and definitely the chamber music is I would say next wave after the symphonic music to come up. And then for the second question, there has been, nonstop, I think there's experimental or composer writing symphonic music with Chinese instrument and as a soloist, like a concerto, for example. Like last year, we did a Chinese music festival in Lincoln Center. We employed 5 different kind of instruments, sona, pipa, erhu, and so on. So, yeah.
And if I could just add, Jindong, to what you said, in the film, one of our characters is Tan Dun, the composer, who has been incorporating Chinese instruments in his music. So we feature in the movie, Tan Dun created this Nushu symphony, and the Philadelphia Orchestra premiered it in the United States and then brought it to China. In fact, they performed Nushu in Tan Dun's home province of Hunan. And that incorporates not only Chinese instruments, bells, things like that, but also Tan Dun is brilliant at, somewhat unusual instruments like rocks and music and using your hands in pools of water. So that is one composer in our film who exemplifies, what you're asking about.
Jennifer, I wanted
Tan Dun was one of the original, how would I say, what's the right word, converts as a result of the 1973 trip. He told me, and I actually
Who was one of the
Conductor.
Okay, got it. Yep.
Yeah, I helped him take his piece to his hometown, and I got to know him a little bit there, and I knew him in the Asia Society as well. But he said, the leadership concert involving Madame Mao and so on and so forth was broadcast on the radio around the nation, and I was at a commune deep in the countryside, learning about the benefits of manual labor. And I listened to this, and it completely changed my mind. I said, I have got to figure out a way of bringing together Western and Chinese music. So that visit really did have amazing ripples throughout the country.
Oh yes.
Indeed.
Jennifer, I've got a question for you, which is, I wonder what was the most moving moment as far as you were concerned when you made the film? Was there one scene or one event that you found very, very moving?
I would say there were two, one large and one small. The large one was the performance of Beethoven's Ninth at the National Center for the Performing Arts with the incomparable Yannick Nézet-Séguin, conducting, and the Philadelphia Orchestra and a Chinese choir from the NCA. I mean, hearing that music, it was one of the best things about editing the movie, because there were, a few of us in the edit suite all the time, and doing that scene, just hearing that music over and over and over again. It was really a delight. But the small scene that I'll never forget is in 2016, we went with the orchestra on tour to China. And Jindong was there too, because he's one of the producers of the documentary. And we staged a reunion lunch where we brought 6 Chinese musicians together with 6 of the Philadelphia musicians who were still performing with the orchestra, and they were veterans from 1973. And I'll never forget this one moment where the Americans were just arriving in this restaurant, and there was a woman who was a violinist with the Central Philharmonic back in 1973. And for the people who haven't seen the whole movie, there's a whole scene about the Philadelphia Orchestra and Ormandy going to the rehearsal hall of the Central Philharmonic to work with those musicians. And it was a very memorable moment for many of them. But this woman, when she saw one of the Philadelphia violinists, Booker Rowe, walk into the room, she ran up to him and she said, "Oh, you gave me sheet music back in 1973. When we really didn't have sheet music. All of ours was handwritten because it had been destroyed during the Cultural Revolution." She said, "I'll never forget that moment." And Booker was kind of taken aback, but this woman, the next year.
That's a Mendelssohn string.
Right. And the next year when we went back to cover the orchestra, I went to their home. And she pulled it out of her, her bookcase and showed me. And she recounted like the conversation that she had had with Booker. So in terms of 73 and in terms of the larger issue of these cultural exchanges, those are the moments that really count. The ones that you don't see, where it's just one person connecting with another person in a way that they otherwise wouldn't. So those were the two, I think, memorable moments.
Let me add to that. I mean, the chemistry between the orchestra members and their Chinese counterparts back in '73 was really remarkable. I mean, the Chinese and they had some sessions together where they played for each other and they showed off their instruments and so on and so forth. And Ormandy conducted their orchestra and so forth. And this was just an amazing event. And they didn't have any problem communicating. They just used, musical language. And I remember one guy who was American whose plate was being filled with food. He said, "Poco pianissimo, please." In other words, be a give me a break. Give me a little salt, be a little less food, please. Anyway, they had no problem communicating, and it was amazing. And those personal connections still last to these days. And
why is this? I guess my final question, because we're coming around to 8 o'clock, but why is that so important? I guess my question is, you know, when political relations are at a low point, what role can cultural exchange play, and why are those connections so important? That's a question for all of you, starting with the gentleman.
Let me just say that people are interested in people, and they're curious about each other. And when they find out that there are common ground, that there are things that they can talk about, common interests, and so on and so forth, it just takes off. The orchestra is very practiced in this kind of thing. They love to reach out to people and do things on a personal level. I mean, they created a sensation during that trip by simply bringing frisbees out into the street in front of the hotel and throwing them around. Chinese never seen frisbees. And the bond between musicians and traditional musicians, as well as modern musicians, was very, 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 very strong, and has lasted again to this day. And I was always curious about, you know, the impact of the orchestra. And I remember going back to China when, in the 80s and the 90s, when things opened up. And I remember talking to taxi drivers, and I would say the word Philadelphia, and the taxi driver would immediately say, "Oh, you mean orchestra, right?" So there was some kind of bond that was created, and it's created by people. Now, let me make a little pitch. If you want to know what happened during that trip, watch the film, but also read my book. I wrote a memoir on my China experience called China Boys, which is easily available on Amazon. And it has an entire chapter which is devoted to the Philadelphia Orchestra, and it's called The Politics of Music.
Yeah, I've read the book. It's fabulous, and I definitely encourage you all to read it. I want to give Jennifer and Jindong a chance to answer that same question. But first I want to ask you a question from the audience, most importantly, which is when and where can we see this film, Beethoven and Beijing? Can we give people any kind of precise, I mean, you know, is there a film festival that can they link on? I guess you were saying, Jennifer, go to your Facebook page, right?
So if you had asked me that question on March the 1st, I would have given you a different answer. But
yes, I know.
Error of COVID, we have gotten into several regional film festivals. So if you go to our Facebook page, Beethoven in Beijing,
so the Facebook page is Beethoven in Beijing, right?
Just go to Facebook, look for Beethoven in Beijing, like these, and we do updates of festivals. And the next one coming up is August the 6th in the Berkshire Mountains. They're having a drive-in, a pop-up drive-in, and they're going to be showing Beethoven in Beijing. There are a lot of things in the works. You know, stay tuned. Hopefully we'll have some big news soon. But the way to really follow us for now is Facebook or Instagram. We also have an Instagram account. Okay, so hopefully there will be some virtual way for people to see the film.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. So back to the question, I want to hear both Jennifer and Jindong talk about why those kinds of personal connections, why is this kind of exchange important? And, you know, at a time of such terrible political relations, what kind of role can cultural exchange play?
I'll let Jindong have the last word, but my opinion is there's a lot of heated rhetoric coming out of Washington these days. And I believe the music of Beethoven, played by an American orchestra in China, is the best way to blunt that. So it's vitally important, I think, that we keep these channels of communication open, cultural, educational, because this is the way we understand, and I think that's what we're seeking.
Yeah. Jindong, what are your thoughts?
Well, the world becomes so interconnected, and so people want it's much easier to understand the other side. I think the truth will come out, and then people want, like Nick said, people want to know people. So I hope music in this, in our discussion, I hope music can continue to serve that role to bring people together.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, I just want to thank all of you so much. I mean, we've had tonight a taste of diplomatic acrobatics, musical history, cultural history, humanity, and a tremendous plug for compassion. So we're really so grateful that you all were able to join us. Please do watch the Facebook page for Beethoven in Beijing, because you will get updates on where and how you can see the film. It is a great film, and please, I hope you all are able to see the whole thing. So thanks again so much for joining us tonight. We're very grateful.
Thank you, Dinda. Thank you, China.
Thank you, Dinda. Thank you.
Good night. Thanks.